Good afternoon. It's September 27th, 2020, and this is episode 27 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. For today's episode, I thought I'd turn to something that is a topic we haven't actually touched on yet in the first month of the Rob Explains podcast, and that is sports ball. More correctly, I suppose, sports in general. As this is being recorded, the MLB, or Major League Baseball playoffs, are underway. Unfortunately, my beloved Orioles did not make the cut, and they will not be moving forward this season, even though it's a shortened season and all of the special circumstances. You always hope that your team is going to make it all the way to the World Series. Well, maybe you do. I have that hope, but I know it's a pipe dream most years. Just the same, I thought I would turn to a legend that's kind of understood by many baseball fans, but for those who only are on the outskirts of the sport, they may not know the truth of the matter. Many people know that the Baseball Hall of Fame is located in Cooperstown, New York, and I've actually had someone ask me before why they would locate it in a small town in upstate New York. Well, that is because Cooperstown is the alleged home of the first official game of baseball. In fact, the Baseball Hall of Fame opened in 1939 on June 12th, the same day as a likely fictional, historical first game of baseball ever played, June 12th, 1839. There are many sports that can trace their way back to a singular origin. Basketball comes to mind. Although many games like basketball have been played, there was a day when a gym teacher nailed a peach basket to a wall and people started throwing a ball at it, and after that we had basketball. Before that we didn't. Baseball, however, does not have such clear roots. Well, if you believe the true story over the legend. The legend, as it goes, is that Abner Doubleday, who was a Civil War general, a hero of the Civil War, and then later a hero in the Mexican-American War, actually invented the game of baseball. And he held that first game back in 1839, before the Civil War, when he was a younger man. That first game was held in Cooperstown, New York, and then eventually he went off to war, not once, but twice, and took the game with him. What evidence, you might ask, is there to support this story? Well, there is evidence that he wrote a letter from Mexico while there during the Mexican-American War and asked for equipment that sounds an awful lot like baseball equipment so that the fellows would have some opportunity for sport. But that is about it. There's no other real evidence that he started the game. In fact, one of his last letters at the end of his life doesn't mention it at all amongst all of the major points of his life. In another letter, he talks about not actually liking outdoor sport that much. But in the early 1900s, there was a discussion amongst a lot of Americans about what sport was truly American. Spoiler alert, it's lacrosse. It was a sport played by Native Americans, started right here on this continent. But it's not likely that a bunch of white guys from the Northeast are going to acknowledge lacrosse, well, at least back then. So they needed another sport that was truly American. Baseball looks an awful lot like the British game rounders, although the rules are different and the field is different and many things are different about it. It is actually likely that rounders, a game of rounders, with different rules is how baseball started its development. In fact, if you go to the Baseball Hall of Fame, although its memorial field there is named after Abner Doubleday, and the hotel nearby is also named after him, and there's a plaque mentioning the legend as fact at the field and within the building. There's also another plaque that mentions a man named Cartwright. And it is that man who essentially set out a game of rounders, but made up his own house rules. 3 bases plus home plate. The way that people batted was different. He essentially created the modern game of baseball. And he, in that one exhibit, is mentioned as the father of the modern game of baseball. Even though Abner Doubleday, other places in the same building, is given the same credit. But in the early 1900s, that wasn't a good story. We couldn't have our game, America's game, based on a British game. So the story of Abner Doubleday, an American hero, creating the game out of whole cloth, is the story they wanted to go with. And in 2010, the commissioner of the league, Bud Selig, actually seconded this story and said he believed that Abner Doubleday was the father of modern baseball, despite all facts to the contrary. To many people, however, Cooperstown, New York, and the Hall of Fame there stand in for dozens or even hundreds of American small towns where the game of baseball started to take shape. We took a British game and we made it our own, and in that way, it truly is American. Cooperstown is merely representative of all of those small towns. So over the next few weekends, you're likely to hear, at least somewhere, this story about Abner Doubleday and his amazing game that has seemed to survive everything. Player strikes, an earthquake during the World Series, and even a pandemic or two now. Just know, it's not Abner Doubleday's game, even if it still remains America's game. Good afternoon. It's September 28th, 2020, and this is episode 28 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining. As we did last time, I'd like to stay on the topic of baseball. The MLB playoffs are continuing, and I don't know, when doing some research for the previous episode, I came upon 3 amazing facts from the history of baseball that I was fascinated by, and I thought that you might enjoy them too, whether or not you are a baseball fan. So in order to understand why these facts are so amazing, you have to understand a few common things about the game. I'm going to take just a minute to roll through those. If you are familiar with it, you can probably skip forward a minute or two. So the basic rules of baseball are that each side has 9 players on it. There are 9 players in the field, including a pitcher who throws the ball towards the home plate and a catcher who catches it there. There is a first baseman, a second baseman, a third baseman, a shortstop who stands between second and third, and 3 outfielders, right, center, and left. Those 9 players, after getting 3 outs, which I'll get to in a second, then change sides. The ones who are in the field go into bat. The ones who are batting go out into the field. While batting, you have opportunities to hit the pitch thrown by the pitcher, and you have to do so and keep the ball in play. There are 2 foul lines that run from home plate to the corners of the stadium. Anything outside those lines is foul and counts as a strike, so long as there's only 2 strikes. Anything inside that is a fair ball. However, if the ball is caught in the air by a player, that is an out. If the ball is picked up off the ground and thrown to the nearest bag, that is also an out. And a fielding side must get 3 outs in order to change back over to the batting side. You get those 3 outs in 9 innings. So you have 27 fielding outs and 27 batting outs. There is something called a perfect game. A perfect game is when a pitcher faces 27 batters and retires all 27, meaning not a single person reaches base, whether it's on an error, on a base on balls, or a hit. Now, even with a perfect game, often the pitcher will throw well over 100 pitches. The average pitcher in a start will throw somewhere around 100 pitches if they are throwing well and they stay in as long as possible. Generally, this takes them to the 6th or 7th inning. But if you're heading towards a perfect game or even a no-hitter, meaning that some people may have reached base but they didn't get a hit, then often the manager will leave you in and give you an attempt to finish the game where you may end up with over 100 pitches. Theoretically, the perfect game would be 27 pitches long. For the pitcher on the fielding side, he would throw 1 pitch as required to each batter and then retire that batter on 1 pitch. This, however, is impossible. Most at-bats go at least 3 pitches, and generally they will go 10 or 15 or 20 pitches. As a pitcher goes deeper into the innings and starts to get tired, the velocity of the pitch towards home slows down, and obviously this can mean that there's a higher likelihood of hitting the ball, putting it in play, and reaching, ruining the perfect game and the no-hitter. Even your average no-hitter or perfect game is likely to have over 100 pitches. However, Addie Joss, who was a pitcher, completed a perfect game in 74 pitches. That means that he threw just over 8 pitches per batter over the course of 9 innings, which is an amazing feat. And I bring this one up first because it's probably the least impressive of all of them. Just you have to really know baseball to know that that is an impressive feat. But 74 pitches to throw a perfect game. Of course, the perfect game can continue into extra innings as well. If your side doesn't score any runs, you have to keep playing until someone scores a run. But for Addy Joss, he won 3-0 with 74 pitches in a perfect game. A truly perfect game retires all 27 batters that you face. You can do this in the variety of ways that you can record an out. However, a perfect game, I suppose, would involve striking out all 27 batters. That would mean that you have more pitches than the minimum required, which would just be getting a batter to pop out or to ground out on the first pitch all 27 times. And there has never been a perfect game or a perfect game, one where you retired all the sides on 27 pitches. However, Ron Nakai did retire all 27 batters via strikeout. Now, this was neither a no-hitter nor a perfect game, meaning that someone reached in between, but all 27 outs that were recorded were strikeouts. That means that at minimum, he threw 81 pitches just to those 27 batters, and likely he threw more than that to each of the 27 he struck out, and that doesn't include the batters who reached on bases on balls or with a hit. So it's likely he threw upwards of 150 pitches, but he reaches the record books with 27 strikeouts. Probably a feat that will never be matched. And finally, probably the most astounding of all of the facts I'm going to give you today. There was a player named Doc Ellis in the late 60s and early 70s. He was also a pitcher. And it's always a pitcher's dream to throw a no-hitter or a perfect game. Doc Ellis did throw a no-hitter. However, he did it after taking a tab of LSD shortly before the game. Doc Ellis threw a no-hitter on LSD, and it would be the only no-hitter he would throw in his career. Now, for those of you who may not know the effects of LSD, it is a psychoactive drug which can make you hallucinate, it can cause temperature maintaining problems, and basically it screws your brain up. So for Doc Ellis to be able to go out and do something that requires so much physical and mental strain while on that drug is really amazing. And just to think, it takes me 25 minutes just to get out of bed on any morning to do normal day stuff. Good afternoon. It's September 29th, 2020. And this is episode 29 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. Today, I wanted to share with you something I recently learned about and that absolutely blew my mind. Now, to give you a frame of reference, we know about a lot of things that are old. Stonehenge is about 6,000 years old. Somehow, people who didn't even have true civilization were able to stand up many-ton blocks and create a temple in the southeastern side of England. The pyramids, 5,000 years old. A group that actually had civilization was able to build massive undertakings of stone, quarried from many hundreds of miles away, brought there, and then stacked into a pyramid shape. But all of that pales in comparison to what we are going to talk about today. There are very few discoveries that actually make us reimagine our place in the world, in its history, and what humans are really capable of, and in some ways, how long modern humans have really been around. Our discussion for today has been one of those places. Gobekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is a 12,000-year-old likely temple. But in any event, temple or marketplace or town center, it does not matter. It was clearly constructed by humans, and it is 12,000 years old. That essentially doubles, or depending on your statistics, may add by 4,000 years, the amount of time that human civilization has existed. The oldest known civilization was in Sumer. It was a Mesopotamian civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq. The fertile valley between those rivers, which we sometimes call the Fertile Crescent, allowed for the first domestication of both plants and animals, and the domestication of plants and animals then led to society developing. Because when you weren't just hunter-gathering, it allowed you to settle down and put down roots, and then you needed shelter, and then you needed to rely on each other for things, and then you needed a method of exchange, which was when money came out. And we thought all of those things developed 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. But some of the discoveries at Gobekli Tepe have actually added another 6,000 years on top of that. At some point, a civilization was so organized that they built what looks like a temple. It's aligned with some of the stars. It's aligned with the equinoxes and the rise and setting of the sun. And in all aspects, seems like an early civilization's church. But even again, if it was a marketplace or a town center or a pub, whatever it is, it was created by human beings 12,000 years ago, which means 12,000 years ago, people were gathering in a place. They worked together, and they were able to stay there for long enough to build this thing. It is completely mind-blowing, and it changes the way we have to look at our history. This has actually made me dive into thinking about what would happen if human beings just disappeared someday. Because essentially what we have to rely on is that this civilization was advanced in some way, shape, or form. It's likely they had a spoken language and a written language, that they had some sort of monetary exchange, because society requires these things. But somehow, between the building of Gobekli Tepe and the rise of the Sumer civilization, all of that was lost, even though they are only a few hundred miles apart. The people of Sumer essentially rediscovered and reinvented things that must have existed before. So when we look at disaster or dystopian future movies and read the novels, and we think, what would it be like to wake up in a world that had all of these ruins and no explanation for them? We have to think that the people of Sumer may have known these exact things. They may have seen these relics and these ruins and said, some great sky people came down and seeded our planet and we are their offspring. But in reality, it was just human beings, and all of the knowledge they held was lost somehow. And we rediscovered it again, and we went beyond what they could have imagined. We not only built huge temples, we not only built monuments to the dead, we not only built sundials out of large stones that were quarried from hundreds of miles away, but we learned more about civilization, and we built steam engines, and we went through an industrial revolution, and we went to space. And now we are on the verge of moving into the desert, not in the middle of someplace on Earth, but the desert of Mars or the moon, and colonizing for good. And truly only then will we be at the place where all of our knowledge cannot be lost. We will not suffer the same fate as Gobekli Tepe. Because once we are an interplanetary species, then a disaster in one place does not mean the end of all. It just means a chance to come back and rebuild again with the same knowledge, training, and experience we already have. So I highly encourage you to look more into Gobekli Tepe and have your mind blown the way that mine was to find out about this unbelievably ancient site. It's also inspired me to kind of go back through some of the other ancient sites that are somewhat unexplainable, but we can only assume the ingenuity of humans, whether it was 10,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, or last year, it always remains the same. So research Gobekli Tepe, and we'll be back with a new episode tomorrow talking about some more amazing things. Good afternoon. It's September 30th, 2020. This is episode 30 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. Last episode, we talked about Gobekli Tepe, which is a 12,000-year-old temple that was discovered in southeastern Turkey. It is the earliest sign of human civilization. I don't know how, maybe it's because algorithms know me so well, but I was put forward with a story that absolutely blew my mind, probably because I was looking up Gobekli Tepe and other really old places in the world. And that's that a few weeks ago, we found the earliest known archaeological footprints ever on the Arabian Peninsula. Now, you might be thinking, wait, Saudi Arabia, Arabian Peninsula, that's awfully dry. What's the deal with this story? Well, the Arabian Peninsula is a key place when we're talking about migration of early humans, and it wasn't always so dry. So now let's do a little background before we really dive into the story. As you probably are aware, the Earth goes through cycles. It gets warmer, it gets cooler, and the continents have not always been where they are. Plate tectonics cause the planets to move around a bit, and they have done so for the last, few billion years. There is evidence that the Great Sahara Desert was once a rainforest, and evidence that the Amazon rainforest will one day be a desert. Now, at the time, about 120,000 years ago, when these early humans were walking through the Arabian Peninsula, it was still a desert, or at least a very arid environment. But there was a lake in the Nefud Desert, which covers most of Saudi Arabia. This location, a place that's been called Althar by the archaeologists who are there, is in the northwest portion of Saudi Arabia, and it once held a rain-fed lake that was probably seasonal, but would have offered some respite for anyone traveling through the area. And it's likely that these humans who stopped there did so to get a drink. There are between 20 and 30 early Homo sapien footprints there, and they're matched by 107 camel footprints, over 40 elephant footprints, and footprints from various other species. So this was likely a gathering place for many species trying to find some respite from the desert, or from the arid environment at least, heat and the dryness. More importantly, the footprints seem to be going north to south, showing some sort of migration pattern that is far different than how we thought early Homo sapiens migrated. It's been long thought that the cradle of civilization for Homo sapien was Ethiopia and East Africa, and that it's likely that migration happens one of two ways, either through the Horn of Africa and across the Arabian Desert, south to north, and therefore into Europe, or across the Arabian Peninsula and there further north. But the direction of these footprints suggests that perhaps it could be something that we completely don't understand. They could have been migrating both of those directions, or either of them, or they could have actually found a home in this arid environment and not have been migrating at all. They may have been living there. In fact, previously, stone tools dating back to 125,000 years ago have been found on the Arabian Peninsula. So we know for sure that early Homo sapien moved through the area. We just don't really know how. And it is clear that they used this as maybe a watering hole, as a spot to stop and get some respite. And they did so with other species around them. And that's also part of this amazing story. It was long believed that elephants had died out in the area about 400,000 years ago. But here we are, with footprints of elephants right next to early human. And I don't know if everyone feels this way. It could be something that is unique to me. But there was an astounding exhibit at a museum in Baltimore called the Walther's Art Museum, and I love it. I went up to it, and it's actually an entire temple moved from Egypt, stone by stone, and rebuilt inside of this museum. And you can actually reach out and touch it. And I think that's why I like it so much. I run my hand across the stone that was quarried from the ground 6,000, 5,000 years ago, and someone had so much devotion that they hewn it from the earth, they moved it hundreds of miles and stacked it, creating a temple for the god or for their king. And by reaching out and touching that stone, I am connecting myself to that early Egyptian civilization. And, in that moment, we're connected in a way, at least. So when I read this story, I thought to myself, wow, footprints that are 125,000 years old. That's amazing. That's got to be like the earliest footprint we've ever found. And you're probably saying the same to yourself, but we'd both be wrong. This story sent me down a rabbit hole of, oh my gosh, there are really old footprints out there. Now, here we have to draw a bit of a line. The footprints that were found in Saudi Arabia in the Nefud Desert are clearly Homo sapien. Are they Homo sapien, modern humans like us? Likely so, but it's hard to tell. It's impossible to tell based on footprints. We need actual bones, and usually skull bones, to be able to tell the difference. But there are earlier human-like or humanoid footprints that have been found around the world. These get a little more complicated because although they're humanoid, they may not be Homo sapiens. And in fact, in some cases, we know that they're not. And we can assume and should assume that most of them are not. There were several sets of footprints found in Illoret, Kenya, that are humanoid but are not modern humans, not Homo sapien. They were made by Homo erectus, and they were dated to 1.5 million years ago. So there was an archaeologist looking down at a footprint that was cast in soft rock or sand that was then protected by some human or humanoid going for a walk 1.5 million years ago. Even more astounding, footprints were found in Litolia, Tanzania, that are 3.6 million years old. And that just blows my mind. Now, these are clearly not made by anyone that would be recognized as a human. But humans have a very unique foot. Think about your feet, or look at them if you have the ability to, and then look at your hands. And you'll notice that your thumb is down towards the base of your hand and points out at the side, but your big toe points forward along the axis of the foot, and your big toe and your first and second toe are likely much longer and much wider than the remainder of the toes. In fact, some people with a more Romanesque toe, as they say, have a longer first toe than they do a big toe. But that development is everything that makes humans different from apes. If you were to look at an ape footprint, they would have a footprint just like your hand, with the big toe pointing out sideways and coming out from very near the base of the foot or the heel of the foot. But a human footprint, an identifiable human footprint, we will see the toe move up the foot along the axis of the foot and be aligned with the rest of the toes. And when we see the toe, that big toe somewhere in between, we know that we have found an early human ancestor. And that's what we have in Litolia, Tanzania. The toe is aligned with the big toe is aligned with the other toes, but it's somewhat off kilter. It's not quite in line the way that a modern human foot is. Homo erectus had a modern human foot, but it went down a different developmental line that died off. So now we have clearly human footprints that are 125,000 years old, and it turns out are not even in the top 10 of the oldest footprints ever discovered. We have Homo erectus footprints at 1.5 million years old, and we have Laetoli, Tanzania footprints that are 3.66 million years old, and you have to be thinking to yourself, that is the oldest it could possibly be to create a footprint that would last forever. But that's not actually true. There were footprints found at Trachilos, Crete, which is an island just off the coast of Greece, that have been dated to 5.6 million years old. Now, these are not human footprints. It is clear they are not human footprints. The foot structure is not modern human. It's not even Homo erectus. It's not all completely human, but it is human-like. The big toe is aligned with the other toes. The foot is much smaller. The gait is much different than modern humans, but it is so similar, and the foot characteristics align with humans that you have to ask, and scientists have asked, is this a human footprint? And the answer, unequivocally from them, has been yes. And this has caused a huge controversy, because we've always thought of Ethiopia and East Africa as the cradle of human civilization, but it may be that early humans had a much wider biogeographical area than just East Africa. There was a period about 5.5 to 8.5 million years ago where the Mediterranean Sea actually dried up. And it looks, based on these footprints, like early humans may have wandered as far as Greece and areas of southern Europe, or that early humans developed in both areas, from apes, simultaneously and similarly, and intermingled so much that we can't tell where one stopped and the other began. Now, these footprints pale in comparison to what would be a full skeleton. It's much easier, although still very difficult, to find a humanoid skeleton as it is to find footprints. In Ethiopia, scientists found a skeletal remains of Ardipithecus kadaba, which dates between 5.2 and 5.8 million years ago, around the same time as the footprints from Crete. So we can essentially assume that early humanoids, human ancestors, were existing around the same time in both of these areas. We also have a skeleton that's about 7 million years old from Kenya of Auroran tugenensis. And again, you'll notice neither of those have the word Homo sapien or the genus Homo at all, because these are early human ancestors that would later adapt and evolve into human. And finally, in Chad, a 7 million year old skeleton of Sahelanthropus tchadensis, which is the earliest known human ancestor, or an animal that was alive in the human lineage. But all of those skeletal remains were found in East and Central Africa. These footprints are all the way up in the Mediterranean. So either there was a huge biogeographical region where early human or human-like animals were living, or they developed in two places at once. And that's actually supported by the fact that something like humanoid or ape-similar teeth have actually been found in Greece and Bulgaria that have been dated to 7 million years ago. Now, these remains have a lot of controversy. They've called it El Greco. There is some concern, of course, that this has been used to Europeanize human evolution, to take it out of Africa. But it could be an example of convergent evolution, the development of similar traits amongst very different animals spread far apart. For instance, consider a dolphin and a shark, which look very similar, but one is very old and developed that way very early, and one is actually a mammal that migrated onto land and then back into the water. But their traits are very similar. So it could be that these two animals, the one from Europe and the one from East Africa, are actually very different. And East African animals developed into humans, and the one in Europe died out. Or it could be that there was a huge biodome, and they were able to survive in both. Or it could be that early humans developed from two different lineages and then converged at some point to become one line, or one died out and the other survived. Or honestly, it could be we have the entirety of human civilization and history wrong. In the last 20 years, we learned that at one point in Earth's history, there were 4 different types of humans sharing the planet. Now we only have one, Homo sapiens sapien. Maybe we've been incorrect about how they developed, about how many there ever were, because finding hominoid bones are very difficult. And determining that they're hominoid and not an ape or any other kind of creature is also very difficult. And who knows how many have been destroyed through the thousands of years of human history. And all that because a couple of guys dug up some footprints in the desert of Arabia. Good afternoon. It's October 1st, 2020, and this is episode 31 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob, and thank you for joining me on this first day of our second month of daily podcasts. So after the last episode and this episode, I've decided I absolutely have to do an episode about falling down a research rabbit hole, because the last episode, talking about finding early human footprints and human evolution, sent me down yet another one. I got to thinking about the development of humans and how we might be different other than just our feet from our ancient ancestors, and that inevitably brought me to the thought of, well, what else could make us human? What makes us different than other animals around us? And for some reason, that took me to human senses. So for today's episode, I wanted to talk to you about the human senses. And to begin, I'm going to ask you the same question that likely your kindergarten teacher asked you at some point during that first year of school. How many senses does a human being have? You probably answered 5. See, smell, taste, touch, and hear. But if you answered 5, which would have been my answer before I started this research, you'd be wrong. The truth is that humans have likely between 18 and 20 actual senses. And although those 5 are kind of part of them, it's a way oversimplification to say that we have 5 senses. So where did the idea of having 5 senses come from? Surprisingly, it comes from all the way back at Aristotle. Aristotle described the 5 sensory organs and how we take in information. And from that point until today, we are still identifying our senses by the sense organs rather than the data and the input that they actually bring in to the brain. And as I was preparing for this episode, I thought to myself, what is a good example of why you need to describe them differently? And I settled on this. Feel free to let me know if I've missed the bar completely here. You can shoot me a message at anchor.fm/RobExplains/messages. Leave me a voicemail, shoot me a text, and I'll include it in a future episode. So the example I came up with is, what if you were building a robot? Now, if I wanted to describe the senses of a robot, it would be easy enough to say smell, see, taste, touch, and hear. But there is so much more to those 5 senses and more that I would need to make a functioning robot. So let's start kind of at the beginning with sight. Your eyes actually have 4 different kinds of receptors in them. So that means essentially they are 4 different senses. The rods in your eyes separate light from dark. Many animals have this, and that's as far as their vision goes. They see in black and white or shades of gray in between. Funny side note here, we like to think of dogs as having black and white vision, and that's not exactly true. They do have some cones in their eyes, which bring about color. Just not as many and not as diverse. It would be better to say that dogs are red-green colorblind than to say they are completely colorblind. So you have rods in your eyes that will decipher light from dark. That's one sense. Then you have cones, and these cones are dedicated to a certain wavelength of light. These 3 wavelengths are matched to the 3 primary colors, and without any of them, or with a deficiency in any of them, human beings actually have color blindness. So if you are at a sensory deprivation without one of them, doesn't it mean that they're all individual senses? So perhaps we have the senses of light and dark, and the sense of seeing red, seeing yellow, and seeing blue. But we're not done with the eyes yet, because keep in mind, humans also have 2 of them, and they're on the front of our head, which gives us stereo vision, or the ability to see in 3 dimensions. Not all animals have this. Animals with eyes on the sides of their head see a much greater part of the world around them, but they only see it as a flat surface, because their brains cannot tell how far away one object is, like the camera to my face, versus the far wall to my face. They have the inability to tell distance, and therefore stereo vision is really a sense as well. Now let's turn to another of our usual senses, taste. Well, this is actually, if you think about it, 5 separate senses of its own. As you've probably heard sometime over the last few years, you have 5 different types of sensors on your tongue: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. If you're missing any of these sensors, you are missing out on an entire profile of flavors. So essentially, they're all individual senses. And another side note here, while some people report that certain places on your tongue have all the receptors, they are spread all across the entire tongue. So there is no sweet part of the tongue versus the sour part versus the umami. They're all parts of the tongue. Now let's turn to another traditional sense, the sense of touch. And we think of touch as one sense, but much like the other 2 we've discussed, it's really more than that, because there are several different factors when you think about touching, and each of them is driven by a different sensor. There is one sensor that tells us I can physically feel my finger touching something else. There is an object there. But there's other things involved in that sense that are kind of ingrained in it, but are thus also very separate. Like pressure. Is this thing I'm touching pushing back? Is it weighing down? What is the mass as I push against it? Pressure is a separate sense. Temperature. Is that thing hot? Is it cold? And more importantly, thinking of the body as a whole, when you walk in a room, you can sense if it's colder. You can sense if it's hotter. If something were to hit you, it's not just the force of the hit, the fact that something is touching you, but what pressure is it exerting on you? And speaking of getting hit, what about pain? Pain receptors are different than the other receptors. And finally, itch. Now, even when I say the word itch, you may sense an itch somewhere on your body. These are controlled by a different sensor. So there are separate sensors for the sense of touch, but also pressure, pain, temperature, and itch. And just a kind of a quick aside here, we think of the sense of temperature as being one sense, but really, surprisingly, it's 2, because we have certain sensors that sense the external temperature. I walk in a room, is it cold, hot, or is it just right? But there's another set of sensors inside that help us regulate our internal body temperature, When you get a fever, it's the internal thermostat cranking up, and you can actually feel like the room outside is cold and you get chills, or you can feel like the outside of the room is hot and you get sweats, but that has nothing to do with the actual temperature on the outside of the room. It's the interaction between the internal and external thermosensors. All right, let's turn to another traditional sense, hearing. Now, this is really just one sense. Airwaves generally, or if you're underwater and there's water touching your eardrum, the water waves are transmitting energy to the eardrum, which is turned into an electrical signal. It can be heard as a voice or as noise, but we think of the ears as hearing. There's more senses there because you also get your sense of balance. You also get your sense of balance from your internal ears. And although it's in the ear, it's a very different sensor. And we call this sense equilibrioception, the ability to maintain balance. Now let's turn to our final traditional sense, the sense of smell. Now this one is pretty straightforward. Your nose sensors have a chemical reaction that allows you to smell the chemicals that are put off by other things in the air. But smell is separate and yet not, because taste, when we think of taste on the tongue, part of the sense of taste is actually the smell involved. Foods will taste very differently if you have a stuffed up nose versus if you don't. So while it's separate and can be operating separately, it also aids the other senses. So now that we're through the traditional senses, let's roll through some of the ones you may not have heard of before, even though you probably haven't heard of some of those I've mentioned already. Wherever you are right now, if it's safe to do so, I want you to close your eyes and hold out your arms. And I want you to picture in your mind's eye where your hands, your elbows, your forearms, and your upper arms are. And I'm sure you can. Well, that's because of proprioception. That is the perception of where parts of your body are in space relative to other parts of your body without seeing them. This is also part of the ability to close your eyes and touch your nose, which I just missed if you're watching the video version of this. This is one of the senses that goes quickly when you're under the influence of alcohol, and one of the tests that they will use at a roadside actually tests how deficient are you with proprioception. What about kinesthesia, the sense of movement? Now, we could think of this as one sense, and this sense is more about our ability to sense the movement of our own body. Even though I am looking directly at the camera, I can sense that my hands are moving, that my back is moving in support of my hands and my arms, and I know where these things are in space thanks to proprioception, but I also can sense the movement of things based on my sense of kinesthesia. Now, involved in that sense of kinesthesia, but somewhat separate, is the tension sensors. Your muscles have sensors that sense tension. How tense is the muscle? If you've ever seen a big box that looks really heavy and you go to pick it up and you spring it up like you're Superman because the box itself is actually very light. That is several senses working in Congress to say, be prepared for the weight, tension sensors, let's get ready, tense up. And then when it isn't as heavy as you think, your body seems to overreact to it. It's also one of the reasons why if someone's holding back your hand and they pull towards your face, one of two things can happen. For most people, they will be able to stop their hand before it hits them in the face. Some people can't. But for those who can, they have attuned tension sensors. Because once that tension is released, once the brake is released off of it, they're able to then change the tension level to not hit themselves. If you do hit yourself in the face, you may use another sense, nociception. And that's generally the sense of pain. You can include the pain receptors in your skin as part of that, but even greater than that, there are other pain receptors elsewhere that can let your body know that something is wrong. And it was once thought that pain was actually just an overload of the other sensors, but we're learning now that this is a sense in and of itself. Similar to tension receptors, we actually also have stretch receptors. Now, they're not used in the muscle the way that the tension receptors are, but they're used other places in the body. Stretch receptors are used in your stomach to make you feel full, in your bladder or your intestines to let you know it's time to run to the bathroom. And they can also be used in your lungs to know you've taken a big, deep breath. We also have chemical receptors, both in our brain and in our gastrointestinal tract and elsewhere around our body. These help us sense things in our blood and in our diet that are wrong for us or bad for us or possibly could be. And it's thought that the vomiting reflex is in part related to this. How about thirst and hunger? You know when you're hungry, you know when you're thirsty, and those senses would help to regulate hydration and nutrition to keep you healthy. And finally, chronoception. And if you know what that prefix chrono is, it's the perception of time. Now, this one is the one that seems to play the biggest tricks on us, especially these days where we're spending a lot of time alone in quarantine in our apartments. But humans have an innate ability to tell passing of time, generally speaking. If you were to be left alone in a room without a clock or a window, you could generally tell how much time has passed. And in fact, the younger you are, with certain limits, you're actually better at telling time than the older you get. Now, in any moment, we may have a bad sense of time. 5 minutes can feel like an hour, and an hour can feel like 5 minutes. That's the relativity of time, in a way. But over the long term, again, if you were to be put in a room that gave you no indication of the passage of time, you would usually be able to say, I felt like I've been in here for an hour and a half, and 85 minutes had passed. I just hope that's not how you feel when you're listening to this show. Now, I did want to touch on two senses that people suspect that humans have, but that haven't been proven yet. And those are electroception and magnetoreception, or the ability to perceive electricity and the ability to perceive magnetic fields. There are some people who have a much better sense of direction than others, and it's thought that perhaps they have an ability to tap into the magnetosphere of the Earth and be able to know which way is north. Or it just could be that some people have the ability to convince everyone else they know where they're going and bring them along with them. There's also been some studies done about sensitivity to electrical fields, and it seems like some humans may have an extra sensitive sensory receptor to that particular field. Both of those senses are actually shown in the animal kingdom in other animals. Sharks, for instance, have electroreception. They can sense the electrical impulses of one of their prey many miles off. And bats and birds and other animals use magnetoreception in order to navigate around either through migration or on the day-to-day. So you woke up this morning, you thought you had 5 senses. Now you listened to a podcast and learned it might be something more like 20. You're basically an X-Man. I really hope that puts a spring in your step today. Good afternoon. It is October 2nd, 2020, and this is episode 32 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. A couple episodes ago, we talked about Gobekli Tepi, and that really got me thinking about other ancient sites, about humanity, what it is to be human, and I don't know, it just sent me down yet another rabbit hole of research. A lot of it was in support of the Gobekli Tepi episode, so I stumbled upon a list, and I wanted to share that list with you because it actually opened my eyes, and I learned a couple of things, so I figured maybe you would want to as well. So over the next 2 episodes, we're going to be talking about 8 other absolutely ancient human settlement sites, and we'll be working backwards in order of the newest to the oldest. And when you see where we start, you are going to be amazed where we end. Our first stop is one that will be familiar to you if you have had, any religious training at all in your life. The name will jump out at you, as will the reason that it's actually well known. Our first stop is Tel Es Sultan, which is a former city in the West Bank, right outside the town of Jericho. This location was discovered in 1868. Its main use was as a settlement, and it continued as a settlement for thousands of years. And in fact, if you include it as part of the modern city of Jericho, it will have been continually inhabited since 10,000 BC. But they don't count it as that. I just do, because, why not? Tel Es Sultan is the oldest part of the city of Jericho, a city that is already very old. And if you have had any religious training in your life, you'll know the name of the city of Jericho because it is the first city that the Israelites encounter when they return to Canaan. And it is, of course, the city with high, thick walls that the Israelites march around 7 days for 7 times. And when they blow the trumpet, the walls came tumbling down. Now, Tel Es Sultan is actually the oldest human settlement that is going to be on this list. It is the only human real settlement that is going to be on this list. And that is because it was actually treated as a city, meaning that people lived there, they stayed there nearly permanently. While we talked about Gobekli Tepe, it actually was more of used as a temple, and although people did live there for long periods, it was mainly fed by the villages that surrounded it out in the countryside. It remained a hunter-gatherer society, and almost no domesticated plants have been found in the area. Now, that may change in the future, but that's our understanding right now. The same is true about Tel es-Sultan. There is very little evidence of domesticated plants, so it is likely that it was founded, at least, by hunter-gatherer societies, and that at some point the idea of domestication of both animals and plants happened there, and that the city expanded as the number of hunter-gatherers and later domesticators grew. Tel es-Sultan is actually called the oldest town on Earth. It was likely used as a strong place, a fortified place, where people from surrounding villages could all rush to in case of danger and be inside and be safe. And over 2,000 years, they continued to fortify and expand and strengthen this stronghold. Around 7000 BCE is when the Wall of Jericho and the Tower of Jericho were built. This took it from a fortified settlement to an early version of a castle. It would have been nearly impenetrable by the enemy, and in fact, if you believe the biblical account, it remained impenetrable until it was brought upon the attack of the Israelites. As I said, it was discovered in 1868. That's when the first round of excavations began, and they have continued almost continuously since then. They have found mud brick houses and fortifications, as well as flint tools, and it is actually on the tentative list for a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it absolutely should be put on the World Heritage Site as the oldest town in the world, the earliest location that we can show permanent human settlement. Our next site is Tel Karamel, which is a site located outside of Aleppo, or in the Aleppo province of Syria. Obviously, a lot of evidence may have been lost in the current strife that's happening in Syria. It may have been destroyed by the forces of ISIL, but I'm sure archaeologists are excited to get back to this site and see exactly what remains of this really ancient site. It was actually first discovered in the 1970s, and excavations began in 1999. Its age is currently placed at over 12,000 years old, so that means that settlement there began at about 10,900 BCE. Now, you might say to yourself, well, Rob, that sounds like it's older than Gobekli Tepe, and you would absolutely be right. But while Tel es-Sultan was likely a settlement, a place where people came and eventually stayed for long periods of time, Gobekli Tepe was likely an temple or an altar, a place where people would come and worship, likely for long periods during the year, but then they would go out to their villages for other portions of the year. Tel Karamel is something less than that. People didn't really live on the site. It was fortified so that people could be protected while they were there, but they lived elsewhere and only came there for special occasions. Now, eventually, it would become a settlement somewhere around 8000 BCE, but there has been so little excavation, there isn't proof that more longer-term permanent settlement happened at a time before that, which would mean that Gobekli Tepe remains the oldest settlement on our list. In fact, some of the excavations show that there may be evidence that it was settled even longer ago than 10,900 BCE, but we can't say with any certainty. Archaeologists here have discovered bone tools and flint tools and stone tools, including limestone containers. They've even found colerite materials that have been decorated, showing that it was fashioned by human hands. More interestingly, there are what they call the towers of Karamel here. Now, while the Tower of Jericho was a strategically built tower, it was at the wall, it was tall and was climbable, and thus it could be seen as a modern tower. The towers of Karamel were actually big rounded places that were fashioned, they were made, they were developed by humans, but they weren't towers the way that we might think of a tower today. Essentially, in a low, flat plain, they created hilltops, and from those hilltops, they would be able to see for long distances around them. But if you want to see it as a method of defense or a method of protection, then the towers of Karamel actually outdate the towers of Jericho, and they would be the oldest towers in the world. Now, next up is not a settlement. But it was a place of protection for people, and it has been a place of protection for people for a very long time. Approximately 17,000 years ago. We're talking about the Lascaux Caves, and if there is one place on this list that you have probably heard of before, I would bet that it is this one. These are a set of cave system in France that are relatively infamous around the world. If you've seen a picture of cave paintings, it's likely to have come from the Lascaux Caves. Now, these caves were occupied about 17,000 years ago, or about 15,000 BCE. The cave complex was discovered and excavated in 1940. And they are famous not just because it has cave paintings, and not just because they are some of the oldest cave paintings we've discovered, but because of the number and the diversity of those cave paintings. There are over 6,000 representations of humans and animals and symbols and things that we just don't even understand. And as I said, you have likely seen one of these cave paintings somewhere else, especially one of the paintings of a horse or of an early human. Since its discovery in 1940, these cave paintings have been extensively studied, as have the caves themselves. And there is evidence of human beings, as I said, all the way back to 15,000 BCE. Now, human interaction with the cave system has not gone well, and the caves themselves have actually been closed to visitors. But they have actually created a 3D replica of the entire cave system that was open to the public that you can go and tour. Now, it's not 3D as in virtual reality. They have actually created a physical duplicate of the caves that you can go in and walk through at your leisure without worrying about damaging something that is as ancient as the Lascaux Caves. And speaking of caves, that brings us to our last location for this episode, the caves of Altamira. Now, Altamira is a location in Spain. Most specifically, it's in Santillana del Mar, Cantabria, Spain. And while these caves were discovered in 1868 and then later excavated in 1879, they are not as famous as the Lascaux Caves. Why, you might ask? Well, for one, they were the first in time, but the paintings themselves were not as diverse, and there are not as many of them. And once the Lascaux Caves were discovered, they realized that there was a distinct difference between the Lascaux paintings and the Altamira paintings. So much so that they believed that the Altamira paintings may have been forgeries. However, it was later learned, after further study, that the Altamira Caves may have been home to humans up to 25,000 BCE, meaning 27,000 years ago. So it's not that they were forgeries, it's that they were just more crude because they were older. Now, much like Lascaux, the caves have not done well with human interaction, especially since 1902 when real serious excavation began in the area. In fact, the artificial lighting was damaging some of the paints that were used, which obviously aren't real paint, and the interaction with humans was causing mold to grow inside the caves. So in 2002, they actually closed the caves to the public. Now, unlike the Lascaux Caves, they didn't go and build a replica somewhere. Instead, they had another unique solution. In 2014, the caves partially reopened. And in fact, these are some of the most rare cave paintings in the world that you can actually see in person, because they run a lottery. And every week, 5 people are chosen who get to enter the cave if they agree to wear the special protective suits and view those cave paintings themselves. So that brings us to the end of the list for today. We'll come back tomorrow with some even older sites. As I said, right now we are at 25,000 BCE, 27,000 years ago. So just imagine how old the sites are going to be tomorrow. Good afternoon. It is October 3rd, 2020, and this is episode 33 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. We are going to move on to part 2 of our most ancient sites in the world. And not necessarily most ancient by the world standard, but most ancient by human standards. We left off in 25,000 BCE with the Altamira Caves yesterday, and we are going to pick up in 28,000 BCE, or about 30,000 years ago, with a site called Murujuga in Australia. More specifically, it is located in the Dampier archipelago in Western Australia. Now, unlike other places where I could say when it was discovered and when it was excavated, this site doesn't have those dates because it has been in use by indigenous people as long as the West has known about it. Therefore, it is likely to have been in use by indigenous people as long as there have been indigenous people. But based on archaeological evidence, we can put usage of this location back to 30,000 years ago. Now, unlike the cave systems we've talked about, which were used for protection during winter or during inclement weather, this site is more like Gobekli Tepe, where it was a religious site and it was used intermittently for those religious purposes. Murujuga, or the Bora Peninsula, is a sacred place to indigenous Australians, and it has one of the largest collections of petroglyphs in the world. Now, cave paintings would be defined as a human being taking a substance and putting it on the wall in a way that you can recognize a drawing. A petroglyph is a rock carving that is in the form of a shape that we also can recognize as something human-made rather than made by nature. Now, we have dated some of those petroglyphs back to 30,000 years ago, which is where we get the date. But Aboriginal people have been in this location for over 50,000 years, which means it is likely to actually have been used as far back as 48,000 BCE, or about the time that humans, migrated to the area. These petroglyphs are entirely unique because they actually depict several now extinct species. And there are several species that we can identify maybe a close cousin of, and it's likely that they're actually depicting extinct species that no longer exist. In total, with the petroglyphs and other collections of rock art, whether that's stacking rocks or moving rocks around on the ground, there are over 1 million pieces of rock art at the site that again has been in use for possibly 50,000 years. And the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation has been seeking UNESCO protection for this as a World Heritage Site, but it has yet to be granted. For our next site, we return to France and the Chauvet Cave. Now, the Chauvet Cave was discovered only back in 1994, and it was excavated as soon as it was located. It was first in use likely around 34,000 BCE or 36,000 years ago, and it's located near Ardèche, France. In this location are some of the most intact and well-preserved cave paintings in the world. Now, unlike Lascaux, France, where it was kind of well known there were cave paintings there, and for 150 years, 200 years, people were able to go in and visit them. When this was discovered in 1994, the site was actually closed to the public shortly thereafter. That allowed us to actually preserve and protect all of the cave drawings. Much like Lascaux, a 3D model was built and a replica was produced so that people could go through and walk through and see what it would be like to be in the cave without actually risking damaging the real site. Chauvet Cave is actually considered one of the most important prehistoric sites because of the value of the cave paintings. They actually depict animals like rhino and lions and deer, and animals you would not think of as inherently European, yet they're found in this cave in Europe. So that has many things that could be suggested from it, and scientists are still trying to figure out how it comes that the people who are in this cave would depict those animals. Also, while it was first in use about 34,000 years ago for several thousand years, the cave was then sealed off through some means. But archaeological evidence now suggests that it was rediscovered by another group of early humans and then reused several thousand years later for a period of several thousand years. And strangely, once it became sealed off again, it was then left undiscovered until 1994, some 30,000 years. So we move to our penultimate site, the Cave of El Castillo, and we move even further back in history. The Cave of El Castillo was in use around 38,000 BCE, or about 40 to 41,000 years ago. It is located in the area of the caves of Monte Castillo, Puente Vecchio, Cantabria, Spain, and it was discovered in 1903. Now, while other ones may have more well-preserved or more well-known, the Cave of El Castillo has some of the oldest known cave paintings ever, again, dating back to nearly 41,000 years ago. It was first discovered in 1903. And has been excavated and studied extensively since then. And in fact, in 2012, the cave paintings were reanalyzed and the date was actually pushed back. It was pushed back so far that scientists now believe that these paintings may not have been left by humans at all. They may have been left by Neanderthals. Now, while we think of Neanderthals as human, they are not distinctly like modern humans. They are a dead branch of evolution, not the Homo sapien that has led to Homo sapien sapien, modern human. But there is some disagreement about the dating methods and the fact that Neanderthals would have the ability or the desire to leave cave paintings. So that question will be one for future scientists. And finally, while the caves in Europe have stepped us back a few thousand years at a time, we leave Europe and take a gigantic step backward to Theopetra Cave in Thessaly, Greece, where it is likely humans inhabited this location 133,000 years BCE, or about 135,000 years ago. This site was discovered in 1987 and has been studied and excavated and protected extensively since then. Now, while this location doesn't have cave paintings, it does have one interesting attribute: what is likely to be the oldest known human structure in the world. While we know today that humans were there for a very long time, this actually wasn't known until 2012. After several decades of research and excavations, archaeologists finally revealed to the public that humans had been living there over 135,000 years ago. That made it the oldest archaeological site in the world, and the last one that we're going to discuss. Early estimates put human habitation in the cave at 50,000 years, which is amazing enough. But a new area of excavation located some children's footprints. And I don't know why, but that concept just touches me something extra special. The children's footprints discovered in a new area of the cave push that date back 80,000 years. So 135,000 years ago, very early Homo sapiens sought to shelter against a storm or wild animals or any number of very scary things in the very dangerous world in this cave at Theopetra. And they moved as far back in the cave as they dare go. And they had children with them, playing, and they let them wander freely to the back of the cave. And at some point, those children stepped in some wet sand or some rock that was soft. And when they walked away, they left footprints that we wouldn't discover until after the year 2000. And much like that temple in the museum in Baltimore that I talked about, I cannot imagine being an archaeologist and putting my hand near in a footprint that was left by a child 135,000 years ago. More than that, Theopetra Cave is a cornucopia of archaeological treasure. There are artifacts from several different periods, including the Paleolithic period, the Mesolithic period, and the Neolithic periods. So all throughout that 135,000 years, at different periods, more humans sought shelter in the same cave system. Most importantly, and maybe most strikingly, this cave is home to a 23,000-year-old wall, the oldest known human structure. And based on its location and the usage of the cave, it's likely that some very early human engineer built that wall to protect the people inside from some cold winds coming from outside. So as they say, necessity is the mother of invention, and perhaps that was true even 23,000 years ago, when some husband and father, tired of hearing the complaints of his children and his wife, said, you know what, I'm going to do something about the wind, about the draft. Dear, just give me a bit. And discovered building, discovered engineering, built a wall to protect his family from a cold wind. And little did he know, some 20,000 years later, we would find that wall and the footprints of his ancestors' children and bones and pottery and tools from every generation between him and those children and many generations afterward, leading to a site that is a treasure trove of 135,000 years of human history. And that number is almost incomprehensible. 135,000 years. But let me try to give you some perspective on that very big number. A generation is generally about 30 years. It's a group of babies that grow up around the same time period and become adults around the same time period and then go through their adulthood around the same time period. So we can take a 100-year period and break it down to be about 3 generations. That makes a 1,000-year period 30 generations. That means going back to the year 0, the separator between the Common Era and the era before the Common Era, would be 66 generations. 66. Keep that number in mind. That is a huge number. 66 generations ago, Rome ruled the known world. Now, if you quadruple that number, you'll get to 233 generations. That gets us to about 7,000 years ago, or 5,000 BCE. This is when the earliest known and widely studied human civilizations were arising. The Egyptian civilization, the Indus River civilization, the Yangtze River civilization. Earliest known human settlements, permanent settlements on Earth, are 233 generations ago. Now, I know this is a big leap, and maybe even this is too big of a number to really comprehend. But to get back to 135,000 years ago would be 4,500 generations. That's 20 times longer than the distance between us and the Egyptians. In that time period, we changed from early humans to modern humans. We became truly Homo sapiens sapien. We went from a small band and tribe, and at some point our numbers dwindled to only a few hundred, to where it stands now at nearly 8 billion people. We went from traveling on foot from place to place and hunter-gathering societies to maybe forming a permanent human colony on the moon or on Mars, and being able to farm so much food that food waste is the real problem. 4,500 generations, and all of that history in one cave, in one place that we now, modern humans, can study. If that is not a cool, interesting, and random fact, I don't know what is.